Did you set out to change the world when you were younger, or did you set out to entertain?
No, I mean, if I look at myself in contrast to my marvelous 23-year-old daughter, who's, radically trying to do all sorts of things now, I'm quite ashamed of the fact that it didn't even occur to me to do anything until pretty well the day of Live Aid. I mean, I just remember watching that TV show and feeling a bit uncomfortable in 1984 and 1985 and thinking maybe I better buck my ideas up. And sort of retrospectively, I can see that there are things that fed into that being quite a strong transformation. But it certainly wasn't much on my mind.
It was literally a "we must do something" moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And then I kind of peel back and think I was raised for 4 years of my life. We lived in the Philippines, and I suddenly realized, that did have I was profoundly aware of how well off my family was in comparison to the people we drove past under the corrugated iron shacks. So that sort of left a mark. And then I remember my mum cancelling Christmas in 1968 during the Biafra famine, and we just had beans on toast and no gift presents, and all the money was meant to, we gave away everything that we would have spent that year to that campaign. So there were things that had planted themselves in my mind, but no, I was a late starter.
And yet, I suppose it really defines who you are now, doesn't it? I mean, much more so than being a scriptwriter.
Yeah, the balance has slightly gone skew-whiff now. When I first started, we did 2 Red Nose Days in a row, but then we did them every second year. So I kind of was doing a quarter of my time on what, as it were, could be loosely called charity work. But now it's got up to about 3/4. So, but I mean, in a way, I look at it as though it would have been a lovely idea to have 2 careers, and maybe I might have stopped at 40 and started the writing and started doing something else. So I think I've just had 2
You're on your second career.
simultaneous careers. Yeah.
Yes. But not only have you had this other life, you've had lots of different, very successful bits to it. So not content with comic relief, and that's raised over £1 billion over 30 years. You were involved with Make Poverty History, and you're now involved with the UN. What is your current goal?
All the stuff that I did in my 30s and 40s turned out really to be to do with the Millennium Development Goals, which was this set of goals that was trying to help the poorest people in the world on all sorts of issues like, education, health, poverty, hunger, those kind of things. And that's what we were raising money for. But I didn't think about it in its formal context. And so the Make Poverty History campaign 2005 was actually saying to the richest countries in the world, we've got these goals, you better double your money. So what happened when I sort of heard that there was going to be a sequel, and I think about myself and sequels, Bridget Jones 2, not as good as Bridget Jones 1, but I thought, well, I should try and focus on making these new goals as accessible and as famous as they can be. I can't make them effective. I can't change the politics of it. But if the world knew about this plan, if the Sustainable Development Goals got embedded in business, in the way that NGOs work, in the UN's real priorities and in government priorities, then we could have a much more optimistic next 15 years. And the Sustainable Development Goals, in contrast to the Millennium ones, they're 17 goals. They're a big portmanteau. So their aim is to make us the first generation to end extreme poverty, last generation to be threatened by climate change, and the most determined generation to fight injustice. So they were really comprehensive plan. It's like if the world is a business, they really are the 10-year plan laying out what we're going to do in every single country on every single subject. And I think that it's so difficult achieving things globally that the idea that there actually is a global plan on which people have agreed is an amazing, optimistic, inspiring, and with any luck, effective idea. And my job is, as it were, to help advertise that. We're doing the world's largest lesson, which gets out to kids in 100 countries. We helped the UN with the launch so that the Global Citizen Concert was shown in 80 countries in the world talking about these goals. We've set up a thing with Bill Gates called Goalkeepers, where we try and gather the best campaigners in the world and the most supported businesses and spread the news. So I'm just doing everything I can with all the help I can to make people know this plan exists and, as it were, to use it as the wind beneath their wings when they're trying to do, powerful, world-changing things.
Is optimism the thread that has run through everything you've done?
I would always say justified optimism. I'm on that side of the argument which says that when you open the door to people doing the right thing, absolutely extraordinary things happen. So, comic relief is an unlikely idea, getting comedians who are basically not good people to help raise money. And we've got, over £1 billion. And, we've just sold 40 million red noses in America to people who may not really want that red nose, but they think, well, actually, I've got an opportunity to do something that's good. And just endlessly through, businesses that we work with, schools that we work with, famous people. I wrote a note to Jo Rowling asking whether or not she'd send me a signed book of Harry Potter. And she said, what I'll do is write you 2 little books. And I think we've made £28 million as a result of that letter. So I believe enormously that when people are offered the opportunity to do the right thing, they mainly take that opportunity. And I also notice in the world that an extraordinary number of great things are happening. So the number of girls that are in school is radically higher. The last 25 years has seen this astonishing cut in child deaths. In fact, everyone in the world lives for 10 years longer than they did when I was born. We've knocked out all sorts of diseases. Malaria's on the run. HIV feels like it's under control. Polio's down to its last 10 people. So all over the world, there are amazing things. And one of my points is simply to make people hear about them and believe in them, because I sort of see the progress of the world a bit like the tortoise and the hare. The hare's all the bad news, attracting all the attention, all the news, making us feel that things are getting worse and worse. But slowly coming along is all the scientific, technological, social progress that it's harder for guys like you to report, because you can't say another good day in the battle against malaria.
Yeah.
What you have to say is one child murdered.
Yes.
And you talk about a child murdered for 4 weeks, whereas in that 4 weeks, we've had something like 30,000 children surviving who wouldn't have survived before because of the progress against one disease.
But to be an optimist, you also have to believe that people's suggestibility to do good is greater than their susceptibility to do bad.
Yeah, well, I do believe that.
And you do believe that. I mean,
Yeah.
but why?
Well, you have to speak from your own experience. I've been brought up in what I think is a, extremely civilized country I've never been attacked in the street. And I know that if I came from another country, it would have happened a lot of times. But, I'm suspicious of the romanticization of bad things. So I know everything that's wrong with my films, believe you me. But if you make a film about a soldier who goes AWOL and murders a pregnant nurse, something that's happened probably once in history, it's called searingly realistic analysis of society. If I make a film like Love Actually, which is about people falling in love, and there are about 1 million people falling in love in Britain today, it's called a sentimental presentation of an unrealistic world. And I just don't believe that at all. My experience tells me that everywhere in the world, there are heroes and brave people working to achieve extraordinary things. And of course, there's tremendous greed, tremendous corruption, tremendous violence, but the balance of that does not seem to me to balance up against all the goodness there is in families and countries and businesses around the world.
But you've worked with politics a lot in trying to achieve some of the things you've achieved. And you've certainly had to deal with governments and officials. How do you see things at the moment? I mean, because a lot of people think we're going through a bad period. Do you think we're going through a bad period?
Obviously, we're all concerned about, the distraction of Brexit, whichever way, that ends up. But, on the other hand, President Macron has just committed to reaching 0.7 in aid. The number of women that are represented in parliaments around the world is growing all the time.
So there's a juggernaut of progress.
There's a juggernaut of progress that is unstoppable, and I think there genuinely is. I mean, and look, I have to take other people's word for it, but I think that the danger of fragile states, migration, there's sort of talk about a new poor, about the fact that refugees, both sort of inside their own countries and outside, now staying for sort of 10 years, that there are 65 million displaced people. I think that there are shifts which are dangerous and worrying and bad, but that's all the more reason to ask for something like the Sustainable Development Goals to encourage people to think globally and invest more money in avoiding those situations.
What would 20-year-old Richard Curtis think of this conversation that you're having?
Well,
Did it come as a surprise?
One, shocked by how white my hair is. I mean, that would be the main thing. How did you get so fat, and what happened to your red hair? That would be the main thing. And I think the 20-year-old would probably say, but do you know any facts? Does he actually know anything? And the truth of the matter is I've mainly still got my heart going for me, my optimism and my experience of the possibility of getting things done. So I think that he would be duly skeptical, but quite pleased I was even still, alive. And I did have an instinct when I was young for practical help. I used to be annoyed by friends of mine who would sit in the pub spending a lot of money on beer, saying how rotten society was, and never giving that money to homeless people on the streets of our town, And I think that sense of doing rather than talking is something that I've always believed in.
So what did you think you were going to do when you went to university?
Well, I hoped. I had a feeling I was going to be a very great actor. And I was very quickly disabused of that because I just couldn't I was always cast as the third gentleman or the clown or Fabian. So then I started doing comedy simply to be able to do some acting, but I had to write it. Then I met Rowan, who was my closest friend. And
Rowan Atkinson,
yeah,
for those people who aren't
and
sure.
it was pretty clear from 21 that I was going to be a comedy writer. I think that's what I thought I was going to be.
How did you start writing rather than acting?
Well, actually, I used to write we had a weekly magazine at school, which I tried to write funny things for. So I was drifting in that direction, yeah. And then I just started writing, sketches for a little show in my own sort of college and university. And then I started writing. So I started writing 3 minutes for Rowan and then for Not the 9 O'Clock News. And then I started writing 30 minutes for Blackadder. And then I started writing, an hour and a half, like 4 weddings.
Not the 9 O'Clock News is worth talking about for a minute. I mean, why do you think there are no shows like that now?
Aren't there? I mean, Sasha's new show is sort of satirical and aggressive, and Saturday Night Live is, carrying that baton very brilliantly in America at the moment.
Yeah,
So,
they're both American shows. I mean,
yeah.
the 9 O'Clock News was really very British, wasn't it? It tapped into huge things about British culture.
Yeah, oddly enough. I mean, I think there is a strange structural thing there. More people watch TV, and the TV stations, of which there were fewer, found people they thought were good and put them together to make sketch shows, which is the best way of making sketch shows. Because actually, if just 1 or 2 people are making a sketch show, it's very hard to be good enough over 30 minutes. So actually, sort of Monty Python and Beyond the Fringe and Not the 9 O'Clock News were slight constructs from a group of people who were all found and put together. And I now think that the sort of powers that be and the agents try and get every individual to make their own half hour, which I think leads to slightly thinner gruel and not quite enough opinions in one comedy show. So I think there may be structural reasons, but I mean, you just got to watch the amazing stand-up comedy these days and you see satire and criticism of the powers that be are not dead. It's just at the moment those TV shows have gone slightly out of fashion.
And those sorts of shows, but those
I think
shows,
it's a shame, by the way. I think that's one of the things that should be a remit, in fact, of, I've also worked on Spitting Image. I think it's one of the things that all the TV stations should commit to, is doing one satirical show just in case they get a hit. I think it's as important as doing the news.
but the cultural impact of those sorts of shows for decades was huge. So if your generation grew up with Python, my generation grew up with Not the 9 O'Clock News and Blackadder, and it would form the basis of our schoolboy conversations pretty much every day.
I know.
With people...
Literally, at school, in the sort of cafe we went to, half the conversation was people repeating Monty Python sketches. Literally half of it. I mean, there would have been incredibly long silences if we hadn't all been able to say that's an ex-parrot. But, kids nowadays are talking about other stuff. It's just not those shows. I mean,
But are there
Love
things
Island,
that are as cohesive?
well, Love Island in the last few weeks, we've all talked about that enormously. I can't wait for the royal wedding. See Danny and Jack walk down the aisle. But I don't know. I mean, it's not as cohesive, but when I listen to my 14-year-old talk, his group are certainly watching the same things on YouTube and watching the same Instagram accounts and paying attention to the same musicians. So they're more the things they particularly love. So they're not things that I'm talking about, but all his little cluster are sharing the same experience. And by the way, going back to the sort of change in the world thing, one of the things I'm noticing is that, and this is more to do with my daughter, but that small groups of young people who get a bee in their bonnet about an issue can really quickly get in touch with each other. And my daughter did a campaign about period poverty, and she did a protest outside 10 Downing Street where there were, 3,000 girls between the age of 15 and 22, and they were all passionate, they were all painting, they were all carrying signs, and they got the government to transfer £1.5 million of money from the tampon tax into this issue. So I think actually for activism, the kind of small cells of dangerously committed people may be a really brilliant way of making
change.
Progress. Yeah.
I mean, you talked about your films and how they're characterized. I mean, how conscious have you been of wanting to make romantic comedies and keeping them in that vein?
So I wrote Four Weddings, which was the first one to be a success, not thinking it was a romantic comedy. I wasn't keeping, as it were, Pretty Woman in mind. I was trying to write a movie like Breaking Away or Gregory's Girl or Dinah, these sort of autobiographical movies where love was necessarily a part of it. And then it turned out to be a sort of formal romantic comedy. And then I thought, oh, well, I know how to do that. I'll write one. And so I wrote Notting Hill. And then I thought, I'm a bit tired of that. So what I'll do is write one where I do 10 of them, which was Love Actually. And then I meant to call a halt. But then I wrote the last film about time, and that was really about family and fatherhood and how to spend your life. But because I can do the romantic comedy thing, I thought I'd put in some of that in the first half. So it's not that I've been trying to, there has been a journey where I've tried not to repeat myself, but it may not be noticeable.
No, I think it's definitely noticeable. But no, what I mean is, those films have changed the world. I mean, they've changed lots of people's lives. They've given people lots of happiness. They watch them over and over again. And I imagine you're probably less likely to sort of claim them as proud ways of changing the world than Comic Relief or Make Poverty History. But they are significant things, aren't they?
No, and you have to think about that. And by the way, all people in entertainment have to think about that and think, what are we doing with our, time? And I definitely believe in that. I'm obsessed by the Beatles. And if I had to say what's brought, the most joy into my life, it'd be the songs of those four men. And that's just like a serious, like they've been like my best friends throughout my life. So, and I do believe that what there is in the world is a pile of bad things and a pile of good things, a pile of things that make you happy and that make you sad. And I think your life, you're lucky if it's 60-40. But I don't believe that the bad ones ruin and infect the good times, nor that the good times, and optimism doesn't mean you should pay attention to how harsh life can be. So I'm very pleased that if the films have added hours of happiness and sort of comfort and optimism into people's lives, yeah, I think that's a good thing to do. I'm glad to do the other thing as well. I'm slightly, again, I believe in practical action. There are some writers who seem to point out how bad things are, and I always wish they'd, as it were, have an action button at the end of their work as well, and be seen to be trying to change things rather than just pointing out how things need to be changed. But that's just me.
When Comic Relief began, it had a fairly simple proposition, which was to help people at home and abroad, and you'd raise money and give the money away.
Yeah.
How did the idea develop in your mind once you'd started?
Again, these things happen by accretions. And so I got sent on my own to Ethiopia, saw the most terrible things that, human beings should never encounter, such sorrow in the middle of this terrible famine. And so that sort of branded in my mind forever the idea of the sort of simultaneity of human suffering. I can't really talk to you or live my life without knowing how hard other people's lives is. That's always on my mind. And I came back and did the obvious things, which I got in touch with my friends and said, let's do a stage show like The Secret Policeman's Ball and raise 100,000. And we did do that. And then literally at the party afterwards, Lenny said to me, it's so weird that we were all doing stage stuff, whereas we're all TV people. So I said, you're quite right. Let's do a TV show. So then we did a TV show, and I said, but the difference, often telethons had been just sort of endlessly asking for money and not much happening, everybody just saying, how are we doing, rather than actually providing entertainment. So we came up with this idea of doing, as it were, 5 hours of comedy and 2 hours of serious asking. And then, once we'd done it, we thought, well, we might as well sell something, which was the Red Nose. And then we thought we might as well do other TV shows. So we did Celebrity Big Brother and all the challenges. And we thought, wouldn't it be great to have business deals? So we worked with Sainsbury's and we worked with Mars and we worked with, so and then we thought we should be in schools. It was just spreading the brand as far as it could go. And that went on until, in a funny way, until I had a conversation with Bob Geldof, in which he said he'd raised more money over a cup of tea with Mitterrand than he had in the whole of Band Aid and Live Aid, because Mitterrand said, oh yeah, you're right, we should go from 0.1 to 0.2 of the French budget, and suddenly that was $1 billion. So that's what has drifted me into the political side of things.
But as time went on, and when you lift the lid on something and you look in and you go to Ethiopia first and you see this terrible suffering, presumably as time went on, you then also saw the scale of what you were trying to solve.
Yeah.
And and what a big task it was.
Yeah. But that's where you have to be humble too, because you can't do everything. Obviously, the people spending their whole lives trying to improve one estate, in a tough part of Britain. But what I believe in is that you should never be demoralized by the size of all the problems when you can help some of them. So, of course, you have huge issues all over the world. But if you can say, well, in this town, in this county, in this place, we can do something about street kids, or we can do something about malaria, or we can do something about girls' education, if we can open this school, if we can pay for this hospital, if we can set up this domestic violence line, it's just step by step. I'm never frightened by the size of the problem, because the only way of, as it were, building a wall against all the horror is to build the wall, is to do it brick by brick. It's exactly the same as you doing your job or me doing the writing job.
And do you think people are still movable in the same way, using the same techniques of going there and saying, this is what's happening, they're people like you?
Well, I don't know. I think we're at a really interesting time. I mean, I do think we're at a really interesting time. There's no doubt that at Comic Relief, we started to make on the night harsher and harsher films. And actually that almost happened by chance. Our camera was following a woman who was taking her kid in for a test, and then suddenly the kid got super sick and had to be put in an ambulance and driven to a main hospital. Our cameraman was in the car, and the baby died in the car. And we put out that film. We asked the mother permission, and that raised a lot more money than anything had done. So we started to talk more about child mortality, and that's where we made a lot of money. And it's harder, or it seemed harder, to make money when you talk about optimistic things, when you say this is going well, this is happening. But I think there is a shift. I think the younger generation now wants to know exactly where the money's going to. I think they want to see it. I think they want to feel that the core issues are being addressed rather than to feel sort of blind panic. Now, I think I would never try and raise money without a core of emotion, because then I've never been to a meeting about comic relief where it hasn't helped saying how passionately I care about it. Otherwise you're just in some kind of deal. But I do think that there are really interesting ways, particularly of raising money now. Charity Water, who I admire enormously, they raise money for wells. When you sign on to them, you get told exactly where your well is, and you get given a thing of how much water it's sending out. That's deeply satisfying. Donors Choose is another brilliant place where they show films by teachers in classrooms saying, we need these books, we need these pencils, we need these facilities. And you've got a list there of, we need $500, and you see the 8 names. So I love all that. So I think we might be into an age of specificity and sort of reason and understanding rather than raw emotion. But in the end, it may well balance out that you need both. I'm excited by how charity and protest are changing. And my daughter's friends who are in the area of they're having so much fun. They're the least miserable girls I've ever met.
Do you think the two things go together?
They're talking about FGM, and they're talking about child brides, and they're talking about really serious issues. But they're so enthused by being young and active, and I love that idea.
So do you think that charity and activism and protest do need to go together more now?
I don't know. I think fundraising is sort of the gateway drug, oddly enough. I think the moment you give a $5, you're more invested in that issue than you were before. And in a funny way, I look back at how do you change the world? Again, going back to the title here. When I look back at comic relief, I'm not sure that the educational value hasn't been equal to the financial. I actually think the fact that, when I talk to the guys in One Direction, they've been watching comic relief since they were young. They've got a sense of those problems. They know there's a dark heart in Britain. They know that there are all sorts of issues, abroad, which are both intractable but can actually, person to person be helped. And I think that sense of an awareness that other people's lives are hard, that you can do something about it, and that it's not necessarily miserable. I think that educational achievement might be as important as the money we've raised, because I think it'll create an environment where, as time goes by, politically and socially, we'll be less and less willing to accept the worst things in the world and in society here.
And how do you navigate helping people in conflict zones without being accused of helping one side or another or getting involved in the politics of it?
I think that's extremely difficult. And right in the early days, I seem to remember Comic Relief giving some grant in the middle of the Gulf War, and suddenly it said on the front page of, Red Nose Day helps, Saddam Hussein or some such thing. But I'm a believer that you should trust the people who are, working really close to it. Comic Relief has just given a huge grant to Help Refugees. Help Refugees is a young organization that actually meets people on the beaches who are fleeing from conflict zones and helps them sort themselves out and get to where they want to go to. So, we've also supported the White Helmets. So I think that you have to trust people who are experts. I've never given away any of Comic Relief's money. They wouldn't trust me to do it. But we have a group of 15 people who really study it and work and know what the best thing to do is.
Do you think there are people in the world who get ignored because of that? Because charities think they are too difficult and controversial zones to get into?
Look, I really don't know the answer to that question. I imagine that it is so, and that I think these are the hardest places in the world to deal with. And that may be why the shift in where poverty and inequality is happening is particularly in war zones, because actually we're sorting out the systems much better in what used to be. I mean, I think India and China used to have the most poor people. Extreme poverty. And I think in 10 years' time, it's going to be the DRC and Nigeria. I think that the map of poverty is shifting, and I'm now trusting politicians to really focus, as they focused in 2005, on the general spread of extreme poverty. I'm hoping that they will put their minds into conflict.
So let's talk about Make Poverty History then. Some people say Make Poverty History, was shafted by the government. What would you make of that criticism? That you didn't really get what you thought you got. That when Bono and Geldof stood up and said this was a huge achievement, it was all money that had already been pledged somewhere else, and you were being conned.
Well, I don't believe that to be true. And I think that, particularly the debt cancellation, which happened earlier, was an extremely important political move. I think that, I always feel that what we're trying to do is take steps forward. And what you're trying to do is take as many steps forward as you can in the full knowledge that there'll be steps backwards. But if you've taken 3 steps forward and you take 2 steps backwards, it's better than having taken no steps forward and those 2 steps backwards having happened. My sense of it is that the MDGs were accelerated by it, that certain countries, particularly the UK, but certain countries did put in more money, that the amount, even if it wasn't doubled in the way that we wanted it to be doubled, that doesn't matter enough to me. Yeah, it was a lot more. It raised the profile of those issues. It actually meant that George Bush was a president who strangely did more than President Clinton on all these issues in terms of the USA. So, there was progress. It was an enormously complicated agenda, and some of the agenda didn't work, and then some of the agenda, did. So I would just say it was definitely worthwhile of the millions of people in the country who supported the campaign, and the quite few people who organized the campaign, and the pop stars who played in Live Aid. It was definitely worth their while.
Did you understand it all? Because it's a horrifically complicated world, isn't it, of all of these things? And,
yeah, fortunately, my job is to simplify. So Make Poverty History is saying, if you're an idealist, if you actually want the world to get better, these are issues that are of interest to you. That's quite a lot of information. That's about all I've got in my head.
So who were the detail people?
There are a lot. Actually, there are a lot of detail people. In fact, the detail people for campaigning are in danger. Are a danger to it, because as you talk to them, they find it impossible to extrapolate the emotional issues. So there's all sorts of issues about, I think the Sustainable Development Goals have either 165 or 169 targets. And I'm always saying to them, can we just have 10 amazing things? What's happening on child brides? What's happening on electricity for the world? What's happening on the temperature of the planet? But they're really trying to work out how to summarize and get all accurate data on all the 169 of them. So I promise you, there are experts on everything. They really know their stuff. They really know the complications. I think Bill Gates is the only guy who actually understands. Maybe Jeff Sachs as well. But I think there's also, I would really say, my message to anyone watching the program is, don't worry if you're not that clever, not that well-informed, and not in that powerful a position, because all of those things were true of me. And as long as you do your best in what you understand with the people who you know, you can do more than it might be thought possible. The idea that me and some comedians, with the amazing partnership with the BBC, could raise, $1.5 billion, that's odd. And it's because a lot of people want to help, and a lot of people don't know that much, but know that it's likely that the money's going to be well spent.
Because that's always the sort of the question, isn't it? That's raised by the skeptics. You know, what happens to the money? Is it being well spent? Is it being well looked after? To what extent can you be sure, or do you just have to?
Well,
to trust?
that's very good. I mean, Cynics Nose Day has not raised any money yet, you know, and I've seen an enormous amount of good, you know, on the ground that our work has done. And I also think that I'm understand, but am emotionally perplexed by the cynicism about charity. When you do charity, you are dealing with the most complicated situations in the world. You're dealing with extreme poverty, dysfunctioning states. If you're over here and you're dealing with refugees, or you're dealing with domestic violence, or you're dealing with mental health issues, or young men's suicide, these are really, really, really hard issues. Now, if you go to a restaurant, the number of times you like all three courses is very rare. But you don't say, not going to a restaurant again. You know, I didn't like 25% of my meal. I'm never going to eat out. And yet, when you're dealing with charity, if 25% of the money doesn't quite achieve what it wants to achieve, or if it's harder to deliver than it should be, or if a new experiment doesn't go quite right, it's insane to say, well, I won't give money to charity again, because you're dealing with really, you know, tough things to get right. So my experience in life tells me that the people working in the charities are just human, but working unbelievably hard in very, very tough circumstances to achieve very, very complicated results. And I think that we should always have a sort of menu which goes from working on intractable sort of political, social issues right down to vaccination. Vaccination definitely works. And I love the fact that we work for a charity that gives malaria nets and that gives vaccination and that helps people on the streets in the UK. And you definitely know it's made a difference. But I think you've also got to try the tougher stuff. But to be skeptical is useful for trying to fix and work on the systems. But if you're going to be skeptical, also do the work.
How damaging do you think the recent sexual abuse scandals have been? And have they been given the right proportion?
Well, I'll be interested to know how damaging they are. I mean, it's clearly a bad thing. But I think of it in contrast to the sexual abuse scandals in the public school system, which is, percentage-wise, a much more terrible thing. You know, a huge number of boys that I know were abused who were at school with me. And yet, you know, the schools are thriving. They're trying to work out systems to do that. So in the same way, I think that the charities have to be much more rigorous. And I think that it has been damaging. And probably the charities have to find new, interesting, exciting ways of re-engaging people in a way that they believe that their money is going to be directly delivered and delivered on the ground and probably delivered without too many potentially abusive intermediaries. So, you know, it is part of civilizing our society. You mustn't allow that to happen. And whenever you're challenged or something bad happens to you, you do have to do better. But I, don't feel that, as it were, society as a whole is tipping away
that people
from
won't
trying
give
to
it
change
because
itself.
of it.
Exactly.
What do you also think about, there's quite a big movement now towards saying big charities like Oxfam or Save the Children or those sorts of scale charities shouldn't have as big an infrastructure as they do. They shouldn't have as many employees as they do. And maybe it's better to just give the money to people and let people decide what to do with the money themselves. You know, and that actually charity might get in the way by buying things, by buying food and tents. And
Do you know, I don't
clothes,
know that I should answer that question. I mean, my instinct, and I think there's really interesting things happening of direct money. I mean, I do think it's an interesting idea. If you have £1,000 and you give it to somebody, and with that £1,000, as it were, they can buy a taxi, and therefore they've got a job for life, and therefore they can feed their families.
Stimulate their local economy.
Yeah,
and all of that.
is that a better thing? Now, it's obviously a tricky thing to give away £1,000, quite who you're giving it to, and it was the fear of that which stopped that. But I think direct money giving is going to get more popular, and I think it is a kind of interesting and radical idea. But it's not really for me to say about Oxfam and Save the Children, apart from the fact that I've seen amazing work that they've done that has saved lives, and they were the people who originally, I was with those two charities when I saw the astonishing work they were doing, you know, in Ethiopia when I was a young man. So I'm sure that they are really worrying and really working out how to deliver, you know, the best they can.
And how do you feel when you see politicians chipping away at the percentage of GDP Britain gives to foreign aid?
I don't like it. I was born in New Zealand, raised in Sweden, the Philippines. My parents were Australian. So I may not be the most patriotic person in the world, even though my films feel very English. But I literally can't distinguish between someone who lives in Newcastle, someone who lives in Kent, and someone who lives in Kigali, and someone who... I mean, I can't see there's any argument why we aren't all equal and we aren't all in exactly the same position. And it seems to me that one of the responsibilities of government, 10% of the responsibility of government, has got to be to take care of the world and to take care of other people in the world. I just fundamentally disagree with the idea that the only responsibility of a government is to take care of your own country, because we will be screwed. And that is one of the things about the Sustainable Development Goals and why they're so attractive to business, because business is now saying to itself, if we've got dysfunctional countries, if we've got climate change, if we've got a world that isn't working, no one's going to be able to have any jobs and no one's going to be able to have any money. So I just... both as a human being and practically thinking, people who don't think that money that can be extremely well spent to help the prosperity of the world, and then money that can be spent actually saving lives tomorrow, isn't money well spent. I think it feels to me like populist and nationalist nonsense.
Should we spend more? Should we spend more than 0.7%?
Well, I would, but that's just me. I mean, and the world is so hard. The world is so hard. I mean, when I think of the extraordinary work that nurses and social workers do in this country, can you imagine doing that job, going to families where life is really hard and where you're not wanted and you've got to try and work out day by day? I sometimes complain about my life, but the heroism of people who are working in charities, earning no money, giving their lives, edging towards making other people happier, is so extraordinary. And I'd like them to have, you know, all the money in the world as well, which they don't have. And mental health issues. My sister took her own life and she was never well served by the medical system that should have been protecting her and taking care of her. But no amount of money could have saved her life in a way. It was very intractable. And in the face of that, the number of things that are dealable with, I think that we should spend as much money around the world as we can on those things too.
Do you think there's a formula for individuals as to how much of our own personal wealth we should try and give to other people?
No, I don't. I mean, I think that's in a way the point of tax. And I think that in some ways that the taxation system is performing that function. So I'm very unsympathetic to people who want to pay less tax, and very unsympathetic to companies that don't pay enough tax, because I think that is in a way the world's way of sorting out how to take care of both our land, but also the people, you know, inside it. And I must say, I sometimes, you know, if there's anyone in there who's angry about tax, that's a battle that I think that's a way to change the world. I remember talking to Gordon Brown 10 years ago and saying, you know, I read a book called Capitalism's Achilles Heel, which was about companies not paying tax. And I said, that sounds like a big issue. He said, it won't come up in our lifetimes. And it sure has. And although we're not working out yet how to deal with it, that'd be a great one to crack. And by the way, another way how to change the world is obviously one of the ways is to use the thing you are, not to say, well, in order to do this world-changing thing, I've got to change my character. So you're changing the world by doing your job as well and as perceptively with as much humanity as you can. My daughter's changing the world by being as perky, boisterous, and anarchic as she can be online, because that's who she is. Emma, who I live with, she changes the world by using all her friends, all her connections, all her social charm to get enormous amounts of things done for comic relief. And I think that if you're a creative person, if you're a business person, if you're an accountant, Aviva are doing this amazing thing at the moment for the Sustainable Development Goals, where they're trying to benchmark every single business, serious business in the world, on how they're doing on each of the goals. How are they doing on gender equality? How are they doing on responsible consumption? How are they doing on hunger? All of these issues, how are they doing with regard to the oceans? And that's people who work with money, really working on the money thing, not thinking, oh, well, what I better do is put on a show, do a production of Brief Encounter with the managers of Aviva playing, Trevor Howard and Celia Johnson. Do the thing you do. And that's where I've tried to do it. I've tried to be entertaining and make TV.
And do you tend to just carry on? Do you think you'll ever stop? I mean, Emma said you'd made your last film, but that was about 3 years ago, so I don't think that was right.
No, I think I have, oddly enough. I've just finished another film, which I'm thinking is my last film. But I think the charity stuff will be harder. The world stuff will be harder to give up, even though I think I might, take less responsibility and try and actually think of more sort of smart ideas and give them to other people. That might be. I'm a bit in the weeds at the moment. And I noticed that when I work with the UN, that's what I feel a lot of people there are. And I'm trying to supply the graphics that the sort of simplification of the names of the goals and the very clear graphics that they've got, they, were devised by myself and a Swedish friend of mine because we thought the document was just too hard to read.
Why is this your last film then? The one you've just done? What is it? What can you tell us about it?
It's a film with Danny Boyle and it's sort of about the Beatles. Why is it the last one? Partly because I don't feel I've sort of experienced the world enough. I understand 5% of the world, and I found myself in the position where I was enjoying movies that other people made, which took me 2 hours more than movies that I made, which took me 2 years. So I thought, well, why don't I read a book that's longer than 300 pages, go to Scotland, spend some time in Chicago. I just want to live life in this wonderful planet. And I think on the entertainment front, there's quite a lot of work on, as it were, online now. I can leave it be.
I ask everybody what they think is their most outlandish idea to change the world, the one that might be the hardest to deliver. What's yours?
God. I used to say the most important thing was that there should be a government law that you should have to split up with your girlfriend after a year in your 20s, so that, as it were, you could just get out of all those relationships which aren't the right one legally. I think that would create a lot of happiness. And then if there was one you loved when you actually get to 30, you can then go back and say, oh, well, yeah, you, the one I was 24, I still want to marry. I think that would help.
That's more like a Black Mirror episode than a Richard Curtis film.
Well, yeah, Warren. Well, I suppose, yeah, it depends which way. I suppose which way you cut it. I mean, the boring answer is actually the Sustainable Development Goals and the Global Goals. That actually 193 countries and their leaders agreed to an extraordinary, idealistic, and practical document, which said that if we follow these things through, the quality of life on this planet will be both safe and twice as good. And so I would say that for governments to actually try and embed those goals in their plans and take a more international view of the world that is both an idealistic but a strangely practical idea. And you've seen some countries doing it and lots of businesses doing it and lots of humans doing it. So I would actually say, go for the goals, look them up online, find which one you're passionate about and fight for it. I think they're actually a kind of dream scenario.
Richard Curtis, thank you very much indeed.